Have you ever watched someone you love fade? Not all at once, not dramatically, just little by little until one day you realize the light behind their eyes is no longer reaching you. What if your child stopped speaking, not because they couldn't, but because they believed no one was listening, at a five-star restaurant built on rules and silence? A billionaire father sat at dinner while his disabled son quietly watched a piano he wasn't allowed to touch. Then a waitress with no title, no permission, and nothing to gain lifted the boy to the bench, and what she lifted was far more than his body. But what would you have done if you were the father watching the world reach your child in a way you never could? If you were the waitress knowing one kind act might cost you everything? This is not a story about music. It's about what happens when someone chooses to see and when someone finally dares to be seen. If you've ever longed to say, "I hear you," or needed someone to say it to you, stay. And if this story touches something in you, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. The boy sat on the floor, legs folded neatly beneath him, eyes locked on the grand piano across the room. It was a Thursday evening at the Hearthstone, a restaurant more known for its silence than its soup. No one raised their voice here. The lighting was soft, the linens pressed, the wine poured in perfect silence. Every plate, every chair, every breath measured, composed, like a stage play that never admitted it was being watched. And yet, right there in the middle of that well-rehearsed quiet, sat a boy who didn't quite belong, 8 years old, thin, pale, with glasses slightly too large for his face. His name was Simon Whitmore. His legs were curled beneath him the way a napkin folds under nervous fingers. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stared at the piano bench, motionless, uninvited. Unnoticed. Almost. She noticed. Her name was Ivy Garrett, 27, waitress by job title, caretaker by instinct. She moved between tables with practiced ease, water here, wine there, smile when necessary. No one ever looked at her long enough to remember her name, but she remembered faces, and she remembered Simon. She had seen him like this before, quiet, separate, like a page torn from another book and placed in the wrong chapter. That night, as she passed table 6, Charles Whitmore's table, she saw Simon again, sitting on the floor, beside his father's chair, like a forgotten suitcase in a room full of polished shoes. Charles, as always, was composed, gray suit, pressed cuffs, knife gliding through steak as if silence were seasoning. He didn't look down at his son. He didn't need to. No one questioned the billionaire, but Ivy stopped. She placed her tray gently on the nearest stand, her steps slowing just enough to be intentional. Her heart was beating fast, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, recognition, perhaps. She knelt beside the boy, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "Hey there," she said. "You want to try?" Simon didn't move, but his eyes never left the piano bench. Not once. That was enough. With care born from experience and something else she couldn't name, Ivy slid her arms around him, one under the knees, one behind his back. He was light, lighter than she expected, like a paper lantern waiting for air. He didn't resist. In fact, he leaned into her like he'd been waiting for someone to. She stood, slowly, quietly. All around her, silverware paused midair. Conversations halted without anyone admitting they had. Eyes followed, and she walked, straight toward the piano, Simon in her arms. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. She just did it. She set him down gently on the bench, steadying him with both hands. His feet didn't reach the floor. His fingers hovered just above the keys, shaking slightly. Ivy stepped back, not far, just enough to give him space without giving him doubt. Across the room, Charles lowered his glass. For the first time that evening, his expression changed. Just slightly. Just enough. Simon didn't play. Not yet. His hands hovered like they were waiting for permission from the air itself. And Ivy didn't rush, didn't coax, didn't say, "Go on." She just stood there, solid, present, a quiet promise in human form. Simon's fingers trembled. Then, slowly, they dropped. One key, middle C, a note so soft it barely carried past the white tablecloths. But it was enough. A woman at table 3 gasped. Someone whispered, "Is he allowed to do that?" A man muttered, "This isn't a playground." Ivy didn't move. She looked down at Simon, smiled the kind of smile you save for someone who's just come home after a long journey. "That sound," she said gently, "that's yours." Simon blinked. His whole body seemed to exhale. Then he reached again, another note, slightly lower, a deeper tone, not perfect, not even in rhythm, but real. And in that moment, real was enough. He turned his head, just enough to see Ivy beside him. Not in front, not above, beside. Then, as if by instinct alone, he leaned to the side and rested his head lightly on her shoulder. Silence followed. Not the usual, orchestrated silence of the hearthstone. A deeper one. The kind that happens when something sacred has just occurred and everyone knows it, but no one knows what to say. And then a shadow. Tall, dark, moving without sound. Charles Whitmore stood just behind the piano bench. His jaw was clenched, his eyes unreadable, not rage, not confusion, just control, always control. His voice came low, calm. "That bench," he said, "was not made for children, especially not that child." The room froze. Ivy didn't flinch. She looked at him not with challenge, but with steadiness. Simon didn't cry, but his hand slipped from the keys, slowly, like letting go of something he barely had time to hold. Charles said nothing else. He didn't have to. Ivy reached down, touched Simon's shoulder softly, then stood. Before she turned away, she said it, quiet, but clear. "If you didn't want him lifted, you could have asked how many times he tried to climb up on his own." Then she walked away. No dramatics, no defiance, just grace. And in her absence, the piano fell silent again, but not empty, never empty. Long before the piano, before the note, before Ivy, there was just the house and the silence inside it. The Whitmore estate sat on 3 acres of manicured lawn just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. The kind of place you drive past and wonder who lives there, not because of the size, because of the stillness. It had once been full of sound voices down the hallway, soft jazz from the kitchen, the laugh of a woman who didn't mind being late for dinner. But after Evelyn died, the house changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, just less light, less music, less Simon. Charles tried to keep things running. That's what he was good at. Schedules, systems, results. He paid the tutors, hired the best therapists, brought in experts from Boston and New York. Everyone told him the same thing. Your son needs consistency, structure. And Charles gave it. To the minute. Wake at 7. Stretch. Read. Balanced breakfast. Speech therapy. Occupational therapy. Piano lessons canceled after Evelyn passed. Of course. Lunch at noon. Silent time. More silent time. Dinner. Early bedtime. routine, order, predictability, the things he understood. But none of them brought back the sound of Evelyn's laugh echoing down the hall, and none of them brought Simon any closer to him. Simon had always been different, not broken, just wired in a way that made the world feel too bright, too loud, too much. Evelyn had known how to reach him. Through humming, through music, through long, quiet mornings sitting beside him without asking questions. Charles wasn't built for that. He wanted to fix, to manage, to solve. But Simon wasn't a spreadsheet. He wasn't a report with quarterly metrics. He was a child, one that Charles loved fiercely but didn't quite know how to hold. So he didn't, not physically, not emotionally. He loved him by controlling the world around him, by keeping everything clean, quiet, in place, by removing the unpredictable, including people, including sound, especially sound. One afternoon, months after Evelyn's funeral, Charles walked past the music room and saw Simon standing on tiptoe, reaching for the piano lid. The bench was too far, the keys too high. His little hands clawed at the air, not frustrated, just hopeful. Charles stepped in. Not now. Simon. His voice wasn't cruel, just final. Simon froze, lowered his arms, and never tried again. That was the last time Charles saw his son near the piano. Until that night at the hearthstone, every Thursday, Charles and Simon dined at table 6. Always 7 p.m. Always in silence. Charles believed the children needed discipline, not indulgence. His father had been harder, colder. Charles thought he was doing better, gentler even. After all, he let the boy sit beside him. That meant something, didn't it? The staff knew not to speak to Simon, not to offer crayons or children's menus. Charles tipped well, very well, and he didn't like attention, especially not toward his son. Simon didn't protest. He never did. His eyes just wandered to chandeliers, napkin folds, sometimes to his reflection in the glass wall, but mostly they wandered to the piano. The baby grand near the stage hadn't been played in months. It was there for ambience, not performance, a showpiece, not a voice, except to Simon. To him, it pulsed, a silent invitation. The first time Ivy saw him look at that piano, she didn't think much of it, but then she saw it again, and again, week after week. The same posture, the same longing. She asked the hostess once, "Does he ever play?" The hostess shrugged. "I doubt he talks." But Ivy had worked with children before. She knew that silence wasn't absence. Sometimes it was waiting. A hope so quiet it didn't dare speak. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew the way he looked at that piano. And that was enough. Back at the estate, in a room Evelyn once called her quiet haven, Simon had a small upright piano. The bench was still there, untouched. The keys slightly dusty. Sheet music still open to Clair de Lune, Evelyn's favorite. Simon never touched it. But sometimes, in the early mornings when Charles thought the house was asleep, the security cameras picked up a shadow standing in the doorway, not moving, just listening. To silence. Charles noticed everything. He always had. But noticing and understanding are not the same. He saw his son grow thinner, quieter. He watched him stop asking for music during breakfast. Watched his hands, once restless near tabletops and windowsills, curl quietly into the sleeves of his sweater. Still, he said nothing, because saying something might open a door, and doors, once opened, are hard to close, and Charles had already lost too much. So, He stayed in control. He kept his Thursdays, his routines, his table, his silence, until a waitress knelt beside his son and broke everything open. There's a kind of silence that feels safe, predictable, clean. Then there's the other kind, the kind that feels heavy, like it's pressing in from the walls. The Whitmore house had grown full of that second kind. In the mornings, Charles Whitmore drank his coffee in the east-facing breakfast nook. The windows overlooked the garden Evelyn once loved. She had designed it herself: lavender rose, stone pathways, even a small fountain that babbled softly when the wind passed right. Now it was mostly still, like the rest of the house. Simon Whitmore, small and folded into himself, sat across the table. He didn't speak. He stirred his oatmeal 3 times clockwise, then left the spoon in the bowl. Every morning, like clockwork. Sometimes he glanced toward the Bluetooth speaker in the corner, but he never asked for music anymore. Charles noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't say anything. He told himself he was doing right by the boy. That structure, discipline, control. They were love, weren't they? He'd grown up in a house where love looked like obedience and silence meant respect. His father had spoken through expectations, not warmth, and Charles had survived that, built an empire from that. He didn't hit, he didn't yell, he provided. That was enough, or at least, it should have been. But the boy across the table looked smaller lately, not physically, just dimmer, like someone had slowly turned down the light behind his eyes. It had been 5 days since that night at the hearthstone, 5 days since a waitress carried his son to a piano bench, 5 days since that single note echoed through a room built to keep people quiet, 5 days since Charles's voice shut it all down. He replayed the moment in his mind, over and over. The weight in Ivy's words still pressed at his ribs. If you didn't want him lifted, you could have asked how many times he tried to climb up on his own. It wasn't an accusation. That's what made it worse. It was truth, simple, sharper for its softness. On the 3rd day after the incident, Charles walked past the music room. The door was ajar. Inside, the small upright piano stood like a monument to memory. Something was wrong. The floor was covered in shredded sheet music, pages ripped, crumpled, torn down the center, as if a quiet storm had passed through. On the wall above the piano, a single piece of notebook paper hung crooked, clinging by one corner of tape. Charles stepped closer. The handwriting was clumsy, letters carved in thick pencil strokes. Piano only works when she is there. His throat tightened. He didn't move for several seconds. Didn't blink. Then, slowly, he reached up, peeled the page from the wall. The tape gave easily. He stared at the note in his hand, fingers curling, and for the first time in years, his hand trembled. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, the glow from the security monitor, the only light in the room. His jacket was folded neatly on the back of the chair, his sleeves rolled to the forearms. One hand hovered above the mouse. The screen displayed archived footage from the Hearthstone's dining room. He found the timestamp 7:42 p.m. Paused the frame. There they were. Simon, Ivy, the piano. He hit play. Watched it again. The lift. The placement on the bench. The first note. Replay. Again. And again. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was alive. A living thing, timid, breathing, reaching. And he had crushed it. Not by yelling. Not by pulling his son away, but by speaking a sentence that landed like a closing door. That bench was not made for children. The cruelty wasn't in the volume, it was in the dismissal. He had dismissed his son's first brave offering to the world, and now the house was quieter than ever. Not peaceful, just hollow. Meanwhile, across town, Ivy Garrett stood in front of a mirror in her small one-bedroom apartment, brushing out her damp hair. The bathroom light buzzed above her. The mirror was cracked in the corner. Everything was still, except her mind. She hadn't slept much either. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Simon's fingers hovering above the keys, the hesitation, the courage. She remembered the way he leaned into her shoulder, how still he'd been, how real that moment felt, like something bigger than either of them had just happened. And then the voice, Charles's voice, not angry, not loud, but final, and her own voice, trembling but steady. You could have asked how many times he tried to climb up on his own. She hadn't meant to say it, but she also hadn't meant to care. She told herself not to, not about the job, not about the boy. But now she was jobless, and she still cared. More than she meant to, more than she could explain. Back at the estate, Simon stood in the hallway outside the music room, his hands curled into his sleeves, staring at the closed door. He didn't reach for the handle, just listened. For what? He didn't know. Just that something used to live behind that door, something that made the quiet less lonely. And it was gone now. In different corners of the same town, 3 people sat in silence, each one carrying a note that refused to fade. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Ivy Garrett found her hands in flour. She was volunteering at the Maplewood Community Center, helping with a cooking class for teenagers with developmental delays. It wasn't glamorous. The fluorescent lights flickered. The tile floor was chipped. Someone had written, "Meatloaf isn't real" in Sharpie on the wall near the pantry. But it was real. And real was all she needed right now. She didn't talk much that day. Just measured sugar, kneaded dough, showed a girl named Erin how to crack eggs without getting shell in the batter. It helped. It quieted the part of her brain still stuck in that restaurant, in that moment, in that note. That note. It had stayed with her. That middle C, so soft, so unsure, but undeniably alive. The way Simon's fingers trembled, the way his shoulders relaxed when she said, "That sound. It's yours." No one had ever told her that growing up, that her sound mattered. Maybe that's why it mattered so much to say it now. Later that evening, the music room at Maplewood was nearly empty. Ivy had offered to clean up after the children's piano class. Folding chairs, scattered sheet music, a cracked metronome ticking in the corner like an old heartbeat. She was gathering loose pages when she heard it. One note, faint, not on pitch, but real. She turned. At the battered upright piano sat a little girl with only one fully developed arm. The other stopped just below the elbow. Her eyes were wide, waiting to be corrected. Ivy smiled and walked over, crouching beside her. "You don't have to reach the note," she said softly. "You just have to believe you can find it." The girl nodded and played again. Another note, then 2. Ivy placed her hand lightly over the girl's, just enough to guide, not control. She didn't need perfection. She needed presence. Across town, in a house full of order, Charles Whitmore sat at his desk. He was staring at the same piece of paper he'd read 10 times that week. Piano only works when she is there. He hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't filed it either. It sat, folded, on the edge of his workspace like a quiet dare. His eyes shifted to the framed photo of Evelyn, Her hand rested lightly on Simon's shoulder. The boy was only 5 in the picture, his cheeks still round. Evelyn had written in looping script on the back, "He hears more than he says." Charles exhaled. He remembered the last time Simon played a note. It was the night Evelyn died. Charles had come home late from the hospital, still wearing the wristband they'd given him. Simon was sitting at the piano, alone, his hands frozen mid-air. When he saw his father, he stopped. Never touched the keys again. Charles didn't know why. Or maybe he did. He just didn't want to face it. That night, he walked down the hall, past the kitchen, past the room with Evelyn's old books, and stopped outside the music room. The light was on, not bright, just enough to cast soft shadows. Simon wasn't there, but the piano was open, and next to it, something else. The bench moved slightly, as if someone had sat there recently. Not long, just long enough to wonder. Charles stared. Then slowly, so slowly it felt foreign, he stepped inside. The room didn't fight him. It simply received him. He sat down. His hands hovered over the keys. He didn't play, didn't press, just listened. To the silence, and to something beneath it. Not guilt, not yet, just awareness. At Maplewood, Ivy wiped down the piano bench. Her eyes lingered on a scratch in the wood. It looked like a crescent moon. She traced it gently, like it meant something. Maybe it did. Maybe all benches hold stories. You just have to know where to look. She picked up her bag, turned off the light, and left the room. But for the first time in days, she didn't feel lost. She felt tethered to something true, to something worth coming back for. The next morning, Simon stood outside the music room again. The door was open. Inside, Charles sat on the bench, not playing, not talking, just there. Simon didn't enter, but he didn't walk away either. He just stood, watching, waiting, and far across town, in a modest community center filled with laughter and off-key melodies, Ivy sat beside a little girl playing a 2-note song. It wasn't much, but it was more than silence. It was beginning again. It was only 30 minutes. That's all it took. 30 minutes between the note and the silence, between the lift and the fall. After Ivy Garrett placed Simon Whitmore on the piano bench and stepped away, the world had stopped for just long enough to feel something real. But Charles Whitmore didn't see music. He saw a line being crossed, a rule broken, a routine disrupted. He approached the bench like a shadow swallowing light, not rushing, not threatening, just inevitable. Ivy didn't move. She met his gaze with a stillness she hadn't known she possessed. Her palms were open at her sides, her spine straight, not defiant, not apologetic, just there. Charles looked down at Simon, then back to her. His voice, low and clipped. That bench was not made for children, especially not that child. The room didn't gasp. This wasn't that kind of place. But it held its breath. Simon's shoulders curled inward. His fingers slid off the keys like petals caught in rain. No sound, no protest, just retreat. Ivy wanted to say something more. She could feel it rising in her chest, a fire, a fury. A name for every child who'd ever been asked to stay quiet because adults found comfort in order. But she didn't scream. She didn't lecture. She said one thing, quiet, soft, but sharper than glass. If you didn't want him lifted, you could have asked how many times he tried to climb up on his own. Then she turned, not fast, not slow, just enough, and walked away. 30 minutes later, In the back corridor behind the kitchen, Ivy was folding her apron into thirds. Her manager stood beside the sink, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Ivy," he said without looking at her, "we're going to need you to clock out early tonight." She didn't ask why. She didn't cry. She just nodded, placed the apron on the hook by the back door, and walked out into the night. Her fingertips brushed the crease in her shirt where Simon's head had rested. Just for a moment, that was all she carried with her. The following days passed like steam over glass. At the hearthstone, the piano bench sat empty. No one mentioned it. No one dared. The music returned to its usual background hum, sterile and correct. At the Whitmore estate, silence thickened. Simon no longer stood near the piano room. He no longer lingered near the Bluetooth speaker at breakfast. He no longer stirred his oatmeal in careful circles. He just sat, staring at his hands like they no longer belonged to him. Charles noticed. He noticed the way Simon's gaze dimmed, the way his appetite shrank, the way his steps grew smaller. He told himself it was temporary, that children rebound, that maybe Simon didn't understand what had happened. But Charles knew better. He had seen it in the boy's face. That moment, the first time he had ever reached forward in public, unprovoked, unprompted, and how quickly it had been taken away by him. One night, a week later, Charles walked into the music room and found it torn, not messily, painfully, deliberately. Sheet music littered the floor like fallen feathers. The binders Evelyn once kept pristine had been ripped, their pages folded and crushed. Some pieces had been scratched through, lines dragged across notes like erasures of hope. Charles stood there, silent, and then he saw it again. The note, taped now to the inside of the piano lid. Piano only works when she is there. He read it once more, not as a statement, but as a sentence, a quiet verdict. He closed the lid softly and sat down, not on the bench, on the floor, just as Simon once had, miles away. Ivy sat on her apartment floor with a bowl of cereal that had long since gone soggy. The television flickered on mute, reruns of a cooking show she wasn't watching. Her phone was dark. No new messages. No job callbacks. She had written an apology email. Never sent it. Wrote a second one. Deleted it. What could she even say? "I'm sorry for lifting your son into a moment he desperately needed." She shook her head. She wasn't sorry. She had done what was right, but doing right didn't always protect you. Sometimes it got you fired. Sometimes it got you forgotten. She reached for her notebook and flipped to a clean page. At the top, she wrote 3 words. Simon deserves sound. And for the first time in days, she smiled. Not big, not bright, but enough. The piano at Maplewood sat waiting, not polished, not tuned, but ready, just in case someone needed to be lifted again. The wind had picked up. Leaves danced across the long driveway of the Whitmore estate, brushing past the iron gates like they were trying to get out. Inside, it was still, too still. Simon Whitmore sat at the foot of his bed, arms around his knees, eyes on the corner of the room where the wallpaper peeled ever so slightly. He wasn't crying. He didn't make a sound. He hadn't, for days, not even in sleep. Across the hall, Charles stood in front of the bathroom mirror, razor paused mid-air. He had only shaved twice that week. His shirt was pressed, but his eyes gave him away. They looked like they belonged to someone else, someone tired of pretending. That afternoon, Charles made a decision. He walked into the music room. This time, the paper wasn't on the wall. It was on the piano stand, folded, waiting. He opened it again. Piano only works when she is there. He didn't flinch anymore when he read it. He just breathed, then sat on the bench. His hands hovered above the keys. He didn't play. Still didn't know how. But he stayed there for nearly an hour, doing something he hadn't done in years. Listening, not to notes, to the spaces between them. Meanwhile, Ivy Garrett was sitting on the back steps of the Maplewood Community Center, a chipped mug of tea in hand. She wore a jacket 2 sizes too big, borrowed from the lost and found bin. The wind tugged at her hair. Inside, children laughed, badly played piano notes echoing against the cinder-block walls. Ivy didn't join them today. She couldn't. Something was breaking inside her. It wasn't just the job she'd lost. It was the silence that followed. No one had asked her what happened. No one had defended her. Not even Simon. But then again, he couldn't. She knew that. Still, it hurt, more than she expected. She pulled out the notebook again. Under the words she'd written the week before, "Simon deserves sound," she scribbled a question. But who listens when kindness gets punished? She closed the notebook, held it against her chest, and let the wind sting her eyes without blinking. That night, Charles asked his housekeeper for Ivy's last name. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Simon didn't eat dinner. Charles sat across the table, hands folded, plate untouched. He tried, once, to speak. "Simon." He said, "Nothing." He cleared his throat. "I saw your note." Still, nothing. Simon stared at the wall, and Charles gave up. But not in anger, in realization that his control had bought him silence, but not peace. Later that evening, Charles opened his laptop. He pulled up the restaurant's security footage again. Not the moment of the note, not the bench, just before that. When Ivy knelt, when she touched his son like he mattered, when her voice reached him without needing permission. He paused the video there, frame by frame, studying the moment when something invisible had passed between them, something he hadn't understood but couldn't ignore. He opened a browser window and typed Maplewood Community Center. It was late, but the site listed the hours and a photo. Ivy, holding a violin, smiling faintly at a group of kids who didn't care how she looked, only how she made them feel. He stared at the image, longer than he meant to, then closed the laptop gently, not with decision, but with thought. At Maplewood, the next morning, Ivy walked into the music room early. No kids yet, just her and the old upright piano. She lifted the lid, traced a key with her finger, and whispered, to no one, "Do you still work without him?" The piano didn't answer, but she played one note, middle C, then smiled, because it rang just fine. Later that afternoon, Simon did something unexpected. He walked into the music room on his own, the same room he hadn't entered in over a week. He looked at the piano, at the lid still closed. He didn't open it. He just sat, not on the bench, on the floor, like he used to, and waited. Not for a song, not even for sound, just for a reason to stay. In that moment, 3 people in 3 different rooms all sat in silence, not avoiding it, not forcing it, just living in it, together, apart, but connected by something they couldn't name yet, a quiet beginning. After the storm, the morning sun filtered through the high windows of the Maplewood Community Center, casting long amber stripes across the scuffed linoleum floor. Inside the music room, the old upright piano stood quiet. The children weren't due for another hour. Ivy Garrett was already there, rolling up the sleeves of her green sweater. Her fingers were smudged with charcoal from helping a child sketch a butterfly earlier. She hummed softly, nothing with melody, just a sound to fill the space. Then she heard it, the faint squeak of the back door. Footsteps, not hurried, not hesitant. She turned and froze. Charles Whitmore stood at the threshold. In his hands, wrapped carefully in a canvas cloth, was a familiar object, a bench, wooden, worn, but different. He didn't speak, didn't explain, just walked to the center of the room and placed it gently on the floor. Kneeling, he loosened the ties. The cloth fell away, and Ivy saw it. The same bench from the hearthstone, restored, polished, and along the front panel, carefully carved in black lettering, Simon's first stage. Ivy said nothing at first. She crouched beside it, fingertips brushing the smooth varnish. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from recognition. Then, quietly, she spoke. "Well," she said, almost smiling, "I guess that seat finally has a name." Charles nodded, still silent, but his eyes met hers. And in them was something new. Not control, not command, just offering. They stood in silence for a moment, not awkward, not strained, shared. Then Ivy stepped back and motioned toward the piano. "I've got a girl who likes to play with her elbow," she said, "but only on Tuesdays." Charles almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned to leave, but paused at the door. "May I stay?" he asked, voice rough like paper. Ivy tilted her head. "You might have to sit on the floor," she said. And this time, he did smile. That afternoon, Simon walked into the room. He hadn't been told his father was there. He hadn't been promised anything. He just wandered in, drawn by something he couldn't name. He stopped when he saw the bench. He knew it instantly. He walked toward it, ran his hand over the engraving, then turned to Ivy. No words, just a look. She nodded once, like an answer to a question he hadn't asked aloud. Simon stepped up. Ivy helped him climb onto the bench. His feet didn't touch the floor, but they didn't need to. Charles watched from the back of the room. He didn't move, didn't clear his throat, didn't direct. He just stood, still, present. Simon hovered his fingers above the keys, then dropped one. A note rang out, and for the first time since that night at the hearthstone, he looked toward the corner of the room and smiled. Later that week, Ivy and Charles met with the director of Maplewood. They had a plan, a new program, a new name, Silent Keys, a space where children who'd been told they didn't belong could find sound, where benches had names, and music didn't need perfection, only truth. The project came together quickly. Charles handled the funding. Ivy handled the heart. They didn't always agree, but they always listened, and that was enough. The auditorium wasn't grand. It was a refurbished gymnasium in the back of Maplewood Community Center, its walls still bearing the ghosts of basketball lines and taped-up flyers. The folding chairs squeaked when people shifted. The stage was just 2 steps higher than the floor, framed by navy blue curtains. But to Simon Whitmore, it looked like Carnegie Hall, and tonight, it was his. The air was thick with anticipation, not the impatient kind, the kind you feel when something sacred is about to happen. Parents sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers. A row of wheelchairs lined one side of the room. Donors in tailored suits sat beside children with wrinkled song sheets. And in the third row, seat C4, sat Charles Whitmore, no tie, no cuffs, just a soft navy sweater, and eyes that no longer scanned the room for flaws, only for his son. Backstage, Ivy Garrett knelt beside Simon. He wore a simple white shirt and navy trousers. His glasses had been cleaned twice. His hair was combed neatly to one side. His hands, folded tight, trembled just a little. He glanced toward the curtain. A sea of faces waited. His breathing quickened. Ivy leaned in, whispered something only he could hear. Whatever it was, it made his shoulders drop just a bit. Then she stood, lifted him gently, carried him like she had that very first night, and placed him down on the piano bench. Not the old one, his bench, the one with his name. Simon's first stage. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight pooled above him, soft as a moonbeam. He sat quietly for a moment. The room held its breath. He reached out with one hand, hovered over the keys, then, softly, pressed the first note, a single tone, clear, still, alive. Then another, then two more, 4 notes, no melody, no structure, just 4 sounds, hanging in the air like a question. Simon turned slowly to the small microphone placed beside him. He leaned in. His lips barely brushed the mesh. And then, in a voice quiet but unshaken, he said, "Dad, can you hear it now?" At first, no one moved. No one dared. Then Charles stood. He didn't wipe his eyes. He didn't lower his head. He just rose to his feet and clapped. Once, then again, then again. The entire room followed. Not wild, not thunderous, but full, honest. Simon didn't look down. He didn't hide. He smiled. And Charles, still standing, nodded, not as a billionaire, not as a man of legacy, but as a father who had finally heard his son. Outside, the night was cool. The trees rustled like applause that never wanted to end. Back inside, the rest of the recital continued, small hands playing uneven chords, uncertain voices singing off-key, but no one cared. Because in that room, sound meant something else. It meant presence. It meant belonging. It meant someone had reached the bench and been told, "You can stay." After the recital, Charles waited beside the doorway. Simon stood with Ivy, accepting a drawing from a little girl who had played earlier. Charles walked toward them. He didn't speak right away, just placed a hand gently on Simon's shoulder, then looked at Ivy. "I never said thank you," he said. Ivy shook her head. "You don't have to." Charles paused. "But I wanted to." She smiled. Small, soft, real. Somewhere in that moment, something settled, not forgotten, but forgiven. Because sometimes the smallest gestures reveal the loudest truths. Because sometimes true listening has nothing to do with ears and everything to do with heart. Sometimes the most powerful stage isn't built with lights and applause, but with courage, kindness, and a single bench that says, "You belong here." Simon never asked for perfection. He just needed a moment. And Ivy, someone without status or permission, gave him that moment. But let's not forget, her compassion cost her something. Because in a world obsessed with order, those who choose empathy often break the rules we never question. That's the quiet cruelty of discrimination, not always loud or violent, but wrapped in policies, in standards, in silence. So, if this story stirred something in you, a memory, a wound, a hope, don't let it fade. Ask yourself who is still sitting on the floor, waiting to be lifted, and what would happen if you were the one to reach for them? Because sometimes lifting one person can change 3 lives. If this story meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. And join us in the next episode, where ordinary moments reveal the most extraordinary truths. Until then, keep noticing, keep listening, keep lifting.